The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the old house. It was one of those nights when the world seemed to fold inward, cloaked in shadows and secrets. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old books and forgotten promises. Jonathan sat hunched over his desk, his face illuminated by the dim glow of a desk lamp. Papers were strewn across the surface, scribbled notes in the margins, diagrams crammed into the corners. To an outsider, it might have looked like the frenzied work of a genius, or perhaps the unraveling of a mind tethered too loosely to reality. Jonathan liked to think of himself as the former. He was, after all, a man of intellect. A professor of philosophy and psychology at the local university, renowned for his lectures on human cognition and the frailties of the mind. His students adored him, colleagues respected him, and his reputation as a thinker was well cemented. And yet, on nights like this, with the world pressing in and the silence threatening to suffocate him, Jonathan couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that lurked behind his carefully constructed facade. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The headache had returned. It was always the same, starting as a dull throb behind his eyes before blooming into a relentless, pulsing ache. He blamed it on stress, on his overcommitment to his work. But deep down, Jonathan knew the truth. It was the dream. It had started 6 months ago, just after his wife, Eleanor, left him. She had packed her things in the dead of night, leaving behind only a note on the kitchen table. "I can't do this any more," it had read, no explanation, no goodbye. Just those 5 words, scrawled in her tidy, deliberate handwriting. At first Jonathan had been angry. How dare she walk away after everything he had done for her? Hadn't he provided for her, cared for her, loved her? But as the days turned to weeks, the anger gave way to something far worse, a creeping sense of inadequacy, of failure. He had always prided himself on his ability to understand the human mind, to dissect the motives and desires that drove people. Yet he hadn't seen this coming. And then the dream began. It always started the same way. Jonathan would find himself standing in a vast, empty field, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The sky was a sickly shade of gray, the air thick with the scent of decay. In the distance he could see a figure, a woman, her back turned to him. He would call out to her, his voice echoing across the emptiness. She would turn, slowly, and it was always Eleanor. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes hollow and accusing. "Why didn't you listen?" She would say, her voice a whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. Then he would wake, drenched in sweat, the sound of her voice still ringing in his ears. Jonathan had tried to rationalize the dream, to dissect it the way he would a case study. It was guilt, surely, a manifestation of his unresolved feelings about the end of their marriage. But the more he tried to convince himself of this, the less it seemed to make sense. The dream felt too real, too vivid. And the words, "Why didn't you listen?" haunted him in a way he couldn't explain. He had turned to his work for solace, burying himself in research and lectures. But even that had begun to feel hollow. His students noticed the change, whispering amongst themselves about how distracted he seemed. His colleagues gave him sympathetic looks, their pity cutting deeper than they realized. It was on one such night, as Jonathan sat at his desk, trying to make sense of the chaos in his mind, that he noticed something strange. Among the papers scattered before him was a photograph, one he was certain he hadn't put there. It was an old picture, taken years ago, of him and Eleanor at the beach. They were smiling, their faces illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. Jonathan frowned, picking up the photo. He turned it over, and his breath caught in his throat. Scrawled on the back in Eleanor's handwriting were the words, "You're lying to yourself." Jonathan stared at the words, his mind racing. What was this? A prank, a cruel joke. He hadn't seen Eleanor since the night she left. How could she have left this here? He glanced around the room, half expecting to see her standing in the shadows, watching him, but he was alone. The headache surged, sharper this time, and he groaned, clutching his head. The room seemed to spin, the edges of his vision blurring. He closed his eyes, willing the pain to subside. When he opened them again, the photograph was gone. For a moment Jonathan thought he might be losing his mind. But no, he was a man of reason, of logic. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps he had imagined it, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and exhaustion. Yes, that must be it. But deep down he wasn't so sure. The days that followed were a blur. Jonathan threw himself into his work with renewed desperation, determined to drown out the doubts that had begun to creep in. But the dream continued, more vivid than ever. And each time Elinor's voice seemed to grow louder, more insistent. "Why didn't you listen?" Jonathan began to see her everywhere, not just in his dreams, but in the waking world. A glimpse of her reflection in a storefront window, the sound of her laughter in the distance. He knew it wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. And yet each encounter left him shaken, the line between reality and illusion growing thinner. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Jonathan decided to confront the dream. He prepared himself as if for battle, setting an alarm to wake him in the early hours of the morning, determined to take control of the narrative. When the dream began, he found himself once again in the empty field. The air was colder this time, the sky darker. In the distance he saw her, the figure of Elinor, her back turned to him. "Elinor," he called out, his voice steady. She turned, her face as pale and hollow as he remembered. "Why didn't you listen?" "I'm listening now," Jonathan said, stepping toward her. "What are you trying to tell me?" She didn't answer, just stared at him with those empty eyes. Frustration bubbled up inside him, and he shouted, "What do you want from me?" Her lips moved, forming a single word, "Truth." Jonathan woke with a start, his heart pounding. The word echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread he couldn't explain. Truth, what truth? He had always prided himself on his honesty, his clarity of thought. But now doubt began to creep in. Had he been lying to himself all along? He thought back to the photograph, to the words scrawled on the back, "You're lying to yourself." What had Elinor meant? What truth had he refused to see? Jonathan began to dig into his past, retracing the steps of his marriage, his career, his life. He pored over old journals, letters, photographs, searching for answers. And slowly, painfully, the pieces began to fall into place. He had always seen himself as the victim, the wronged party in his marriage. But as he revisited the memories, he began to see things differently. The arguments, the accusations, the moments of silence that had stretched like chasms between them, it wasn't just Elinor, it was him. His pride, his inability to admit fault, his refusal to listen. He remembered the times she had tried to reach out to him, to tell him how unhappy she was, how he had dismissed her concerns, convinced that he knew better. He had been so wrapped up in his own ego, his own narrative, that he had ignored the truth staring him in the face. And now it was too late. The realization hit him like a blow, leaving him breathless. He had deceived himself, clinging to a version of reality that absolved him of blame. And in doing so, he had lost the one person who had truly mattered. Jonathan sank to the floor, his head in his hands. The weight of his self-deception was crushing, the truth more painful than he had ever imagined. But it was also liberating, in a way. For the first time he saw himself clearly, not as the victim, but as the architect of his own misery. The next morning, Jonathan sat at his desk staring at the blank page before him. He picked up a pen and began to write, pouring out everything he had kept locked away for so long. The lies, the guilt, the truth. He didn't know if Elinor would ever read it, or if it would make a difference. But he owed it to her and to himself to try. Because self-deception, he realized, was the enemy. and the only way to defeat it was to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The wind had died down, the house silent once more, but for the first time in months Jonathan felt a glimmer of peace. The battle was far from over, but at least now he was fighting the right enemy.